Vice President, it will be Mr. Cañete that will, Commissioner Cañete, that will make the introductory remarks, please.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, last July, High Representative Mogherini and the Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry chaired the European Union-Egypt Association Council in the presence of Commissioner Hahn, and on that occasion our new partnership priorities were adopted. This was the first Association Council with Egypt in 7 years, so the first since the beginning of the revolts in the Arab War. It is precisely in these times of transition that our cooperation becomes more important. It is important for the people of Egypt and their aspiration to security, democracy and economic growth, but it is essential for the region, from Libya to Syria, and it is essential for Europe, because we are neighbours and we share many of the same challenges. So we are glad that we have managed to reopen such an important channel for dialogue with Egypt. This does not mean that the European Union and Egypt agreed on all files, but precisely when you disagree on something, engagement becomes essential. There is no other way to address any outstanding issue, and in the history of the Egyptian people and of the whole region. Our partnership with Egypt will be structured around 4 main tracks. First, support to the Egyptian government's socio-economic reform agenda. In this field, there has been much concrete progress in the last year. The Egyptian authorities adopted an economic reform plan supported by the International Monetary Fund aimed at bringing back macroeconomic stability and inclusive growth. This is an important step, and we are eager to support the plan, including through our bilateral assistance programme. We are also keen to support Egypt's efforts to address the social and economic impact of this reform, particularly on the most vulnerable parts of the population. The second track of our partnership is building a stronger cooperation on common challenges such as counter-terrorism and migration. Terrorism poses a fundamental threat to Egypt's stability and security, and time and again we stood on the side of the Egyptian people when they were hit by a new attack. It is not just moral solidarity, we are ready for more concrete cooperation in this field, and the partnership priorities are giving us the opportunity to explore new forms of common engagement. Let me add that whenever we discuss counter-terrorism with our Egyptian counterparts, we always insist that repressive measures are never enough to address this issue. Terrorism needs to be tackled in full respect of international human rights standards and fundamental freedoms. On migration, Egypt has made an important contribution in hosting refugees, not least Syrian refugees. It has also significantly reduced irregular migration flows through the implementation of the Valletta Action Plan and the Khartoum process. A better and more humane management of migration flows is in the interest first and foremost of migrants, but also of the countries of origin, transit and destination. So we are currently working with our Egyptian counterparts to launch a high-level migration dialogue. The third track relates to closer dialogue and cooperation on foreign policy and regional issues. Egypt currently sits on both the United Nations Security Council and the African Union Political and Security Council, and beyond that, is an essential partner to address more crises in our region, starting with the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and we share an interest to work more together, including on the conflicts in Libya and Syria, as well as to address the tensions in the Gulf. Last, but definitely not least, there is a strong political track in our partnerships, which includes governance, the rule of law, human rights and fundamental freedoms. The European Union's position on this is very clear, and we reiterate it constantly in our dialogue with our Egyptian counterparts. Sustainable security and stability can only be achieved when human rights, those guaranteed by the 2014 Constitution and flowing from Egypt's international commitments, are fully implemented. If we want to help improve the situation of human rights in Egypt, or to preserve the space for civil society, we have no alternative to engaging with them. It is in this spirit the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, Stavros Lambrinidis, visited Egypt in February to enhance dialogue on human rights with the Egyptian authorities. We continue to pass this message both in public and in private, in all our contacts, both at bilateral level and in multilateral fora. This is what we did, for instance, on the possible consequences of the new NGO law. On NGOs in particular, there is something we should not forget. The European Union is the biggest donor in Egypt. Total ongoing European Union financial assistance commitments to Egypt amount to over 1.3 billion euros in grants. If Member States and European financial institutions' grants, loans and debt swaps are included, the figure rises to 11 billion. A relevant part of this bilateral assistance relies on civil society organisations as implementing partners. Our partnership needs a strong and lively civil society, and this is something our Egyptian friends should also keep in mind. The four tracks of our partnership are closely linked to another. Sustainable security is linked to sustainable development, which is linked to human rights and to regional stability. This is the approach that we have adopted with our partnership priorities, and this is the proof that only through engagement we can address our common interests for the people of Egypt, for Europe and for our entire region. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I also thank you for respecting the time limit. We will now proceed with the speakers on behalf of the political groups. For EPP, Mr. Preda, for 2 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, President. The partnership between the European Union and Egypt is important for the stability and prosperity on the two banks of the Mediterranean. We have interests in common, and we have to confront common challenges like fighting against terrorism, trafficking of human beings, migration and instability in our southern neighborhood. On all these fronts, we need joint action, which is stronger. And that's why our group welcomes the holding on the 25th of July last to the 7th Association Council between the EU and Egypt. An impetus was given to this partnership, and we share the general direction of the priorities which have been agreed on. And I'm pleased in particular to see in the section consecrated to principles of cooperation references to the deepening of the political dialogue on democracy and rights of man, as well as to the necessity of working with organizations of civil society to implement this partnership. The two dimensions are extremely important because we know that there's a lot still to be done in terms of respect of human rights and of involvement of civil society in Egypt. And when we discuss with our counterparts in Egypt, they're the first to recognize this. And I find it's essential to continue to work with them to promote the respect of human rights and to give priority to a constructive approach which will make it possible for us to have better results on the ground. For example, a fact-finding mission of the EPP group, which included Elmar Brok and Maria Gabriel, visited Egypt in November 2016. One of the main messages put across to our partners is that we will support any and all measures that make it possible to introduce international standards in terms of human rights in Egypt. But, of course, that's going to take a long time, and we'll have to support them constantly in order to promote a real democratic transition in Egypt. And from this point of view, the mechanism of monitoring and evaluation which will be developed in the context of the partnership will play a key role, and we have to see to it that it's well equipped to make it possible for us to realize its objectives. Thank you.
Next, for the S&D group, for 1 minute and a half, Mr. Bostinaru.
I've been told 2 minutes. Is the revised speaking time for our group?
Well, I have to check.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. I think we'll
Thank
manage.
you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Commissioner, Egypt is a key partner for the EU, and we welcome the first Egypt-EU Association Council after the revolution and the adoption of the partnership priorities for the period 2017-2020. Egypt is undergoing a difficult period, and its path towards stability and sustainability is so important. Egypt is confronted with a challenging internal situation following the revolution, and the terrorism continues to strike the country, with all its consequences, be it on people, on tourism and economy. We know well how many are the shortcomings, and yet we know and we have to acknowledge the progress already made in certain areas, including the new parliament. But equally, we have to take note about the many areas where EU and Egypt cooperation are of fundamental importance. I mentioned terrorism. There is no doubt that to defeat terrorism we need a close cooperation with all partners, including Egypt. In this regard, I welcome the effort of the President al-Sisi to reform the Islamic thought and to prevent radicalization, as well as the strong effort to protect Christians. It's an example in this area. which prevented recent attacks to be launched against the Christian communities. But let me also add the importance of cooperating with Egypt on migration and for the regional stability. We prize, in particular, the efforts of Egypt to play its very important broker's role into the Palestinian reconciliation. And today, just today, we have taken note about the successful talks between the two sides and the fact that the two sides decided to build up the national consensus government of Palestine. It's an example of what Europe and Egypt can do.
Thank you, and my apology on behalf of us sitting here. You really had 2 minutes, and there was a mistake in the papers, so my apology. Well, we're working on it, you know, in the Parliament, so I thought we are close to the point, but clearly we still miss a few meters to go. Anyway, now for ECR for 1 minute and a half, and I hope that that's not a mistake. Mr. Belder, please.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter. Klopt helemaal.
Thank you very much, President. And from a European perspective, has to be said, the media is extremely important in Egypt. Social media has for months now been debating the fresh elections of Sisi and elections which are coming up in 2018, and that debate in itself is a very positive thing when it comes to electing a president. Fresh elections are possible, and Mr. Sisi's sympathizers, his supporters, have had to concede that they are disappointed because the situation in the country is dramatic from a social and economic point of view. People are even coming to blows over bread. You also have to recognize the huge influence of the military in Egypt, and the Commission should let us know exactly how it plans to deal with the military when it does business with Egypt. Is this part of its vision for 2030? Because the role of the military is likely to be strengthened. I hope the Commission is listening to me, because I would like to have a written answer to that question. I'd like to know how you're going to deal with the role that the military plays in the Egyptian economy. And we have various documents on the partnership priorities, and on page 7 we read that the EU and Egypt should work together to fight terrorism, discrimination, Islamophobia and xenophobia. So there are two words that are missing there. You've got Christianophobia as well as anti-Semitism.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, colleagues. I hope these words are conveyed to the High Representative. The circumstances that Egyptians live in and the EU's relation to this crucial country merit a serious and critical assessment. Considering the increased focus on security, managing migration and now the EU-Egyptian partnership, it is actually shocking and disappointing that the EPP and the SD have blocked this debate for 3 years. And even now, colleagues have ensured that this House does not express itself in a resolution this month. I consider this a cop-out. The human rights situation in Egypt cannot only be relevant for us when it hits home, however terrible the brutal murder of Giulio Regeni might be. And I too echo the ongoing calls for justice in that case. But countless Egyptians face grave injustices and violations of their rights, and we must address their fate too. They face systematic torture and forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and all of this is happening with impunity. Civilians are still tried by military courts, and we have now seen 22 cases of death sentences. Very, very restrictive NGO laws make the work of civil society, including EU-based organizations, nearly impossible. Journalists and bloggers are harassed, and I want to highlight particularly the ongoing imprisonment of Alaa Abdel Fattah. They cannot work freely, and that's unacceptable. Add to that the recent wave of arrests of gay people and intimidation of LGBT people. That is also unacceptable. No short-term cooperation in the field of anti-terrorism or quote-unquote migration management can compensate for these gross violations, Nor can they justify the EU's ongoing silence. Egyptians deserve better and need better. We know what a boiling point can be reached if the needs of the youth are not addressed. There cannot be a partnership without respect for human rights.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, on behalf of GUE, for 1 minute, Madam Matias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Everything that's been said about the strategy the European Union and Egypt need is true as historical partners with cultural partnerships. But there's also Egypt's position on Syria and Libya. But I also want to return to what the colleagues just been talking about, because between partners there can't be taboo subjects, in particular as regards human rights, in both directions, both in terms of infringements of human rights in Egypt and in terms of the same thing in Europe, which is why I should like to say very strongly here that there cannot be clauses in this agreement which are simply remaining on paper. Our responsibility is that everything in the agreement is properly fulfilled, and human rights is not a minor issue. It should be at the same level as economic interests and commercial ones, or even above them. So I'd ask the Commissioner to take into account that to be friends, to be partners, that you have to talk about human rights in both directions.
For 1 minute and a half, Mrs. Lochbihler, please.
Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you very much, President. This partnership means that Egypt and EU have to heed international standards. However, the reality in Egypt is quite different. Civil society activists are spied upon and are threatened and are locked up. Human rights organizations report of torture, arbitrary detention, and also the disappearance of inmates, as well as discrimination against minorities, men and women alike. Now, last year, we passed a resolution on the murder of Giulia Regeni, condemning the disastrous human rights situation in Egypt. Now, you, Commissioner Cañete, mentioned the fact that you have made efforts to support this NGO. What are the results? The most recent partnership agreement is a missed opportunity. The EU ought to have insisted decisively on specific improvements in human rights. For example, it ought to have taken a clear stand on the law on NGOs, which has since been passed, because this NGO legislation is a direct threat to the work of human rights organizations. It's important that we speak plain English to Egypt, that we be clear about what we mean. A number of European member states are, however, selling weapons to Egypt, contrary to a Council Ministers' resolution of August 2013. I think that this policy means that the EU and member states share part of the blame.
Mr. Castaldo.
Thank you, President. Egypt and the European Union undertake to promote democracy, fundamental rights, human rights, as constitutional rights of all of their citizens. Those are words in the EU-Egypt partnership agreement up to 2020. Paradoxical words if you consider that our partner's territory, if anyone who wants to look into 600 cases of disappearance is subject himself to brutality, as the recent suffering of the Regeni family's lawyer shows. He's put in a high-security prison and subject to electric shocks, solitary confinement. The Egyptian Commission for Human Rights and Freedom says the same thing. A strengthened relationship with Egypt is something that we would like to see, but we can't close our eyes or keep silent about disgraceful kidnapping, torture and murder of Giulia Regeni. An Italian and a European, that would be hypocrisy. And today we need once again to call for truth and justice for Giulia Regeni.
Mr. Borghezio, please.
Thank you very much, President. Sorry, the microphone wasn't on. Now, of course, we cannot ignore the importance of this agreement, because there is this issue, of course, of security in the Mediterranean and the whole phenomenon of migration, and unfortunately, of course, a serious matter of terrorism. However, it is important that Cairo cooperate in security, all the more important now that ISIS is on the way to being defeated in Syria and Iraq, and therefore the threat is moving much closer to Europe, to my own country, Italy in particular. But that should not lead us to overlook the serious state of human rights in Egypt. We need a reliable and credible partner in what I view as a friendly country, and that is why we have to speak our minds on certain very serious issues, such as the one which was quite rightly flagged up by one of my colleagues, the case of Giulio Regeni, who is at a European university, and it is rather strange, to say the least, that the European Union has not chosen to look in to the role played by the European university at which he was a student and on whose behalf he was carrying out research. Now, High Representative Mogherini has said that we should defend the memory and the honor of his parents, who are entitled to know the fate of their son.
Now for the non-attached, for 1 minute, Mr. Epitidio. I do apologize, Epitidios.
Thank you, Chair. The EU-Egypt partnership is a part of the revised European neighborhood policy. We are trying to face up to common challenges, to serve mutual interests, and to secure long-term stability on both sides of the Mediterranean. Egypt is a strategic partner of the European Union, and we work together with Egypt on many important issues, like having stability and security in the Eastern Mediterranean, and other issues of mutual interest, like combating terrorism, managing immigration, and serving democracy. Egypt has undertaken commitments to consolidate through its constitution the fundamental freedoms and protects human rights. We work together on energy issues. For example, the new supergiant natural gas field called Zohr will help us. And I would like to say that the tripartite cooperation with Egypt and Greece and Cyprus will help us.
From now on and also in the future. The moment we exceed the time and we continue speaking, I should see that as disrespect to your colleagues. Next time I will just cut you off exactly on the second, and that is regardless of the colleague concerned or the political group. We have now finished with the speakers on behalf of the political groups. We will now continue with Mrs. Salafranca Sanchez for 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, President, Commissioner, honourable members. Egypt, because of its dimension, its strategic situation, because of its influence in the region and the Arab world, because it's a member of the UN Security Council, is called on to be an excellent partner of the European Union. Now, in July, they held the Association Council meeting, and I think that it's a positive piece of news. It was suspended for 7 years, and we understand that in 7 years a lot of things have happened in the Middle East, in Europe, and in the world, and therefore we have to adopt our agenda for cooperation to the new configuration of the threats we face. We have to contribute to stabilization in the region, and of course we can't achieve this until there's some progress in the problem of Syria. We have to get over the differences in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and of course we have to fight against terrorism. It's clear that cooperation in the area of security and energy efficiency and fighting against climate change, both competences of areas Kenyete, are also very important. And we've emphasized the importance held by the new cooperation, the help of the European Union that has to be placed in the area of revised neighbourhood policy, and we have to move forward in the area of the social and economic modernization, trade, etc. And last but not least, respect of human rights. And I want to recall what happened when the Muslim Brotherhood reached power democratically, and there were some insinuations to the head of the delegation for special relations with the Middle East.
Valenciano for 2 minutes.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. The High Representative, Mrs. Mogherini, has defined Egypt as a key ally for our common external policy, and my group agrees. There are many and very serious scenarios going forward in the region, so cooperation with Egypt is a vital necessity for the cause of peace and stability. It is true that this association cannot be at any price, and I share many of the objectives in this association agreement. But I'll take them in the opposite order and start with human rights. Egypt has to change here. It can't carry on with the prisons full of the opposition and oppressing civil society. The European Union cannot allow that. Security, yes. Egypt needs to be supporting terror, to be supporting the fight against terror. It needs to contribute fundamentally to the solving the conflict between Israel and Palestine. But Israel is at the moment far from an absolute democracy. So certainly we must renew conversations, but it's equally important that the Union makes clear that we are not going to keep quiet when citizens' rights are infringed.
Is for 1 minute to Mr. Vistisen, please.
Egypt is a core ally for Europe, and not just a core ally in the region, but also a friendly and constructive country which normally works with Europe for our common interests. And this is both the case of counterterrorism, our common security, on creating stability in a region which has direct effect on our peace, security, and stability in Europe. And this is also true when it comes to the broader policy in terms of North Africa and the Middle East. And the list example where Egypt's attempts to get the Palestinian self-rule to cooperate and to form a joint government, which in the long term would be the only way we can have a realistic peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. Now, we don't know what that's going to produce, but we know that without Egypt and our Arab allies, we won't get anywhere. Thank you.
Colleague, Mr. Schaffhauser for 1 minute.
Egypt is a pole of stability in the Mediterranean, but it's on the brink of collapse. Now, Tunisia is convalescing after the so-called Arab Spring. Libya is a ghost state, and Algeria is poised for a very menacing transition. Now, Commissioner, you were talking about security and development, and on top of that you added human rights. Now, beware of human rights which run counter to security and development, because unless you do so, you'll end up with neither security nor development, and not even human rights. Now, you will be destabilizing Egypt in the name of human rights, whereas in actual fact the government is doing what it can to fight the fundamentalism of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is part of a war we are waging against Islamic totalitarianism, and that should be clear for all of us. Now, Marshal al-Sisi, Bashar al-Assad and others are bulwarks for European countries, and those who seek to destabilize them are complicit with terrorists and the enemies of Europe.
For 1 minute and a half, Mr. Panzeri.
Grazie.
Thank you. I too am convinced of the strategic importance of Egypt on the Mediterranean chessboard. And I think it's fundamental that on the basis of dialogue there should be a joint commitment to the values of democracy and respect for human rights, as is said in the preamble to the document of the Association Council. Which is why I ask how it can be possible today to talk about immigration, terrorism, cooperation and commerce with such clear violations of the preamble through Egypt's repression of human rights. The case of Ibrahim Metadi, a lawyer committed to human rights and involved in the sad story of Giulio Regeni, where he fought hard to get the truth, has been detained under inhuman conditions, or his colleagues Hamada Masha and Anan al-Badra. These are cases, like so many others, which show that our duty is to intervene using the instruments that the partnership offers us. Because Egypt can be brought to change its course on human rights. Now, I can understand political realism, but when it steamrollers human rights, we have to react. The credibility of Europe's external policy is also a matter of how we deal with these problems.
Thank you. Next and last for 1 minute, Mrs. Jill, please.
Thank you, President. This House has shown extraordinary patience with Egypt, which is considered a key partner by many in the House, but I believe it's time we made up our mind. Can we stand by a partner where nearly 400 activists and dissidents disappeared off the radar since August 2016, where students like Giulio Regeni are murdered in cold blood, where 22 people are arrested for waving rainbow flags, and rockets are bought from North Korea? Now, I share the concerns outlined by the High Representative over the economy and the ticking time bomb of youth unemployment, but we can't let Egypt be the sole decider of our partnership, excluding any cooperation on rule of law and fundamental rights. So I have 3 questions to the Commissioner. Our total ongoing assistance to Egypt is worth €11 billion. What are we doing to leverage this? Secondly, what measures have been taken to follow up on the resolution adopted last year, which followed the murder of Regeni, to step up to stop companies from exploiting technology that contributes to human rights violations in Egypt? Thank you.
Thank you, colleague. That is the last contribution to the debate. We now proceed with Catch the Eye. The first that I'm going to give the floor to is Mrs. Schlein for 1 minute, please.
Parliamo di partnership tra UE ed Egitto, ma
Talking about a partnership between the EU and Egypt, but what kind of partnership can you have with a country which rides roughshod over fundamental rights day in, day out? We've got torture and we've got the barbarous murder of a European researcher, Giulio Regeni, and 20 months have gone by. We have been asking for replies. Nothing has been forthcoming, and there is a battle for Giulio and also for many, many more who find themselves condemned to the same fate in Egypt. We've got to fight against forced disappearances and the intimidation which has been faced by Giulio's family and Ibrahim Metadi, who was arrested recently, and also the raiding of the offices from the Egyptian Office for Fundamental Rights. And we have made specific requests for information, and they have gone unheeded. Now there have been accusations of espionage, but Egypt is not a safe country, and it is scandalous. This lack of solidarity we are seeing from other countries who are just carrying on business as normal, doing business with Egypt. And if the EU closes its eyes to the abuse of human rights, it will cease to exist.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, your priorities, our priorities and our ambition in our partnership with Egypt should help the peoples on both sides of the Mediterranean. Growth on one hand, but also human rights, social justice and decent living conditions, economic growth and technical support on behalf of the EU, and at the same time demands that human rights should be respected and the rule of law, because these go together. this should go hand in hand. We should have a balanced approach. It is true that there has been substantial progress in Egypt in many areas, including human rights, but there are still questions that Egypt should answer. But our agenda has two priorities: terrorism and energy security. So let me make a proposal. Let me posit something, that the stability of the Sisi government is essential for us.
Haji Georgiou, please.
Thank you, Chair. We certainly agree that there should be channels of contact with Egypt, as we believe that we should have contacts with other countries of the region, but any relationship at the economic or other level should help the Egyptian people, and in particular help the vulnerable groups. In particular, we should help the young of Egypt for genuine democracy, for freedoms, and there should be a detailed investigation whether fundamental human rights are respected. Any brutal behavior vis-à-vis vulnerable groups should stop.
Next, Mrs. Forenza, please.
Presidente, come
Thank you, President. As a number of previous speakers have already said, it's absurd to be talking about Egypt in this House, to be talking about cooperation with Egypt, without putting at the center of the debate constant violations of human rights. The parents of Giulio Regeni, just a year ago, as Mrs. Schleiner just reminded us, asked us here in Parliament to take up a position on Egypt and on Egypt's silence, which continues to prevail on the murder and torture of Giulio Regeni in Egypt. We continue to pretend that nothing is happening in Egypt and Egypt is a secure country because Egypt is holding migrants back from Europe is a crime. And history will not forgive the European Union for that or for its silence on the violation of human rights in Libya or what Israel is still doing.
As expressed by my colleagues, I'm very worried about the situation for human rights defenders and for human rights activists. I've met numerous women's rights activists that are extremely persecuted at the moment. But today I wanted to raise a specific situation of LGBTI persons being persecuted. I'm sure you have been reached of the reports of persecution that has increased, 33 or more youth being detained, and also we have reports of sexual assault in detention, of violence. And it's also a question of when the authorities do this kind of violence, the public violence, the hate speech against LGBTI people in Egypt is rampantly increasing, and we have reports on that. The EU must act against these human rights abuses, and to say that we are passing on the message, Mr. Commissioner, is just not enough. You don't pass the message about human rights. You demand human rights to be respected. We need a different kind of partnerships.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to the Commissioner, I would like to appreciate one thing across the political spectrum today: the emphasis on human rights respect and also on the clause in the international agreements. I would appreciate if we would remember that debate, because sometimes some of us basically deviate from that very principal issue. So I notice that with a lot of appreciation, but we need to apply it across the board with all international agreements. Commissioner, I would now ask you to, of course you can have a sip of water first, and then give us your reaction. It seemed to me that you wanted to have a sip of water, so go ahead and then give us your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think this has been a very useful exchange, and I thank the honourable members for the interventions. Many of you have addressed different problems related to human rights, and human rights are an integral part of our partnership priorities, and we address the situation both through bilateral dialogue, but also through silent diplomacy and formal demarches, but also through public statements, including in multilateral forums such as the Human Rights Council in Geneva. The European Union has raised clear concerns regarding the blocking of websites and the ongoing pressure on human rights organisations and defenders in its position for the European Union-Egypt Association Council, and call on Egypt to be in line with its commitments to promote freedom of expression, association and assembly, as well as the freedom of the press, as guaranteed by the 2014 Constitution and according to its international obligations. And this position was also expressed in the recent European Union statement at the Human Rights Council under item 4. Some of you have referred to the case of the Egyptian lawyer Medwali Geghassi. This is a case the European Union is following very closely, and we have raised it with our Egyptian counterparts at high level, both in Cairo and in Brussels, and stressed the need to allow human rights defenders to carry on their work, including cooperation with the United Nations human rights agencies and mechanisms, without intimidation or harassment, in line with Egypt's international obligations and the guarantees enshrined in the Egyptian Constitution for democracy, human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this message, as well as on the need to shed light on the circumstances of the death of Giulio Regeni, was clearly expressed in our statement for the European Union-Egypt Association Council, as well as in the recent European Union statement under item 4 in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. You can count on us to continue to insist on this in our contacts with our Egyptian counterparts at all levels. Also, some of you have referred to LGTB situation, and the Commission position is that the arrest of an increasing number of people after the concert of music band Masr Leila in Cairo and the sentencing of 1 to 6 years in prison for so-called practicing debauchery is not in line with Egypt's commitments to promote freedom of expression as guaranteed by the 2014 Constitution, and not in line with Egypt's international obligations. Freedom of expression is essential in a democratic society, and we call on Egypt to take active measures to promote it and to abide by its national and international commitments in this regard. The European Union wishes to reaffirm its commitment to freedom of expression, as well as to the equality and dignity of all human beings, irrespective of their sexual orientation and gender identity. Finally, regarding the situation of Ibrahim Halawa, Ibrahim Halawa's acquittal is welcome news and a relief for his family, for Ireland and for the European Union. And the Commission was particularly pleased to hear that Ibrahim was finally acquitted after 4 years in pre-trial detention. This is a case the European Union has been following very closely and that we have actively raised with the Egyptian authorities in coordination and support to the Irish government efforts. Nonetheless, we remain concerned about the use of a mass trial in which 442 defendants were sentenced to heavy prison sentences, and that is not in line with Egypt's international human rights obligations. The European Union looks forward to the appeals and expects Egypt to uphold its national and international commitments to due process and fair trials. To conclude this debate, I think that we all agree on the importance of our partnership with Egypt, even if there are different views on how to take it forward. As I stressed before, we now need to approach it in a coherent and comprehensive way in order to make the best out of it, in the interest of Egyptians and Europeans. We will continue to look at how best to achieve progress in the 4 tracks of our partnership and to use all the instruments available to us to foster stability, growth and socio-economic development in the country. And we also count on the support of the Parliament to contribute to the success of this partnership and its concrete impact on our people. Thank you, President.
Commissioner, thank you very much indeed. The debate is closed. Before we will proceed to the next point, I would have an announcement. I should like to inform you that the House, I'm sorry, I would like to inform you that the House, once again, I mean, I should like to, the best is when I don't read things, yeah, so I would like to inform the House that pursuant to Rule 231, paragraph 4,